Hello, I hope you are well. On Thursday, we celebrate St. George, patron of England. There'll be a sung mass at 10 a.m. on Zoom, to which you're invited. But I thought I would read for you the legend of George from the Golden Legend. It might remind us of a story that we're not too familiar with in its detail. George, a native of Cappadocia, held the military rank of tribune. It happened that once he travelled to the city of Selena in the province of Libya. Near this town there was a pond as large as a lake where a plague-bearing dragon lurked, and many times the dragon had put the populace to flight when they came out armed against him. For he used to come up to the city walls and poison everyone who came within reach of his breath. To appease the fury of this monster, the townspeople fed him 2 sheep every day. Otherwise he would invade their city, and a great many would perish. But in time they were running out of sheep, and could not get any more. So having held a council, they paid him tribute of 1 sheep and 1 man or woman. The name of a youth or a maiden was drawn by lot, and no one was exempt from the draft, but soon almost all of the young people had been eaten up. Then one day the lot fell upon the only daughter of the king, and she was seized and set aside for the dragon. The king, beside himself with grief, said, "Take my gold and my silver and half of my kingdom, but release my daughter, and spare her such a death." But the people were furious and shouted, "You yourself issued this decree, O king, and now that all your children are dead, you want to save your own daughter. Carry out for your daughter what you ordained for the rest, or we will burn you alive with your whole household." Hearing this, the king began to weep and said to his daughter, "My dearest child, what have I done to you? Or what shall I say? Am I never to see your wedding?" And turning to the people, he said, "I pray you, leave my daughter with me for 1 week, so that we may weep together." This was granted, but at the end of the week, back they came in a rage, crying, "Why are you letting your people perish to save your daughter? Don't you see that we are all dying from the breath of the dragon?" So the king, seeing that he could not set his daughter free, arrayed her in regal garments, embraced her tearfully, and said, "Woe is me, my darling child. I thought I would see sons nursing at your royal breast, and now you must be devoured by the dragon. Alas, my sweetest child, I hoped to invite princes to your wedding, to adorn the palace with pearls, to hear the music of timbrel and harp, and now you must go and be swallowed up by the beast." He kissed her and sent her off, saying, "Oh, my daughter, would that I had died before you, rather than lose you this way." Then she threw herself at his feet and begged his blessing, and when, weeping, he had blessed her, she started toward the lake. At this moment, Blessed George happened to be passing by, and seeing the maiden in tears, asked her why she wept. She answered, "Good youth, mount your horse quickly and flee, or you will die as I am to die." George responded, "Lady, fear not, but tell me, what are all these people waiting to see?" She said, "I see, good youth, that you have a great heart, but do you want to die with me? Get away speedily." George said, "I will not leave here until you tell me the reason for this." When she had told him all, he said, "Do not be afraid, child. I am going to help you in the name of Christ." She said, "Brave knight, make haste to save yourself. If not, you will die with me. It is enough that I die alone, for you cannot set me free, and you would perish with me." While they were talking, the dragon reared his head out of the lake. Trembling, the maiden cried, "Away, sweet lord, away with all speed." But George, mounting his horse and arming himself with the sign of the cross, set bravely upon the approaching dragon, and commending himself to God, brandished his lance, dealt the beast a grievous wound, and forced him to the ground. Then he called to the maiden, "Have no fear, child. Throw your girdle around the dragon's neck. Don't hesitate." When she had done this, the dragon rose and followed her like a little dog on a leash. She led him towards the city, but the people, seeing this, ran for the mountains and the hills, crying out, "Now we will all be eaten alive." But Blessed George waved them back and said to them, "You have nothing to fear. The Lord has sent me to deliver you from the trouble this dragon has caused you. Believe in Christ and be baptized, every one of you, and I shall slay the dragon." Then the king and all the people were baptized, and George, drawing his sword, put an end to the beast and ordered him to be moved out of the city, whereupon 4 yoke of oxen hauled him away into a broad field outside the walls. On that day 20,000 were baptized, not counting the women and children. The king built a magnificent church there in honour of Blessed Mary and St. George, and from the altar flowed a spring whose waters cure all diseases. He also offered a huge sum of money to Blessed George, who refused to accept it and ordered it to be distributed to the poor. Then he gave the king 4 brief instructions: to have good care for the Church of God, to honour the priests, to assist with devotion at the divine office, and to have the poor always in mind. Finally, he embraced the king and took his leave. Some books, however, tell us that at the very moment where the dragon was about to swallow the girl alive, George, making the sign of the cross, rode upon him and killed him. At this time, in the reign of Diocletian and Maximum, the prefect Dacian launched against the Christians a persecution so violent that in 1 month 17,000 won the crown of martyrdom, while many others, being threatened with torture, gave in and offered sacrifice to the idols. Seeing this, St. George, overcome with grief, gave away all his possessions, laid aside his military trappings, and put on the garb of the Christians. He then pushed into the middle of the crowd and cried out, "All your gods are demons, and our God alone is the creator of the heavens." This angered the prefect, who retorted, "By what rashness do you dare to call our gods demons? Where do you come from, and what is your name?" George answered him, "My name is George. I come of noble forebears in Cappadocia. With the help of Christ, I have conquered Palestine, but now I have left all that to serve the God of heaven more freely." The prefect, seeing that he could not win him over, commanded that he be stretched on a rack and had him torn limb from limb with hooks. His body was burned with flaming torches, and salt was rubbed into his gaping wounds. That very night the Lord appeared to him in the midst of a great light, and so sweetly comforted him with his presence and his words that the saint thought nothing of the torments. Dacian, now convinced that the infliction of pain was to no avail, summoned a certain magician and said to him, "It must be by their magical arts that the Christians make light of our tortures, and they hold sacrifice to our gods to be worthless." The magician replied, "If I cannot overcome his spells, let my head be forfeit." Thereupon, relying on his magic and invoking the names of his gods, he mixed poison into some wine and gave it to Blessed George to drink. But the saint made the sign of the cross over the wine, drank it, and suffered no harm. The magician then put a stronger dose of poison into the wine, but the saint, again making the sign of the cross over the cup, drank with no ill effect. At this the magician prostrated himself at George's feet, begged his pardon with loud lamentation, and asked that he be made a Christian. For this he was beheaded in due time. The following day the prefect ordered George to be bound upon a wheel that was fitted with sharp knives, but the wheel fell apart at once, and the saint remained unharmed. Dacian then had him plunged into a cauldron of molten lead, but George made the sign of the cross and, by God's power, settled down as though he were in a refreshing bath. Now, realizing that he was getting nowhere with threats and torments, Dacian thought he might bring the saint around with soft speech. "George, my son," he said, "you see how long-suffering our gods are. They put up with your blasphemies so patiently, yet are ready to forgive you if you consent to be converted. Follow my advice then, dearest son. Give up your superstition, sacrifice to our gods, and win greater honours from them and from ourselves." George smiled and replied, "Why did you not say kind things to me before? instead of trying to overcome me by torture. So be it. I am ready to do as you say." Dacian, deluded, was glad to hear this and ordered the heralds to call the whole populace together to see George, who had resisted so long, finally yield and worship the gods. The city was strung with garlands and filled with rejoicing, and all stood by as George came into the temple to offer sacrifice. He fell to his knees and prayed the Lord to destroy the temple with its idols so completely that, for the glory of God and the conversion of the people, nothing would be left of it. Immediately fire came down from heaven and consumed the temple, the idols and the priests, and the earth opened and swallowed up anything that was left. St. Ambrose says in his preface for St. George, "While Christianity was professed only under the cover of silence, George, most loyal soldier of Christ, alone and intrepid among Christians, openly professed his faith in the Son of God, and the grace of God in return gave him such fortitude that he could scorn the commands of tyrants and face the pain of innumerable torments. O blessed and noble fighter for the Lord! Not only was he won over by the flattering promise of earthly power, not only was he not won over by the flattering promise of earthly power, but he fooled his persecutor and cast the images of the false gods into the abyss." When Dacian heard what had happened, he had George brought before him and said, "How evil can you be, you wickedest of men, that you could commit so great a crime?" George retorted, "You do me wrong, O king. Come along with me and watch me offer sacrifice again." "You trickster," Dacian explained. "What you want to do is to get me swallowed up as you made the earth swallow the temple and my gods." "Miserable man," George answered, "how can your gods, who could not help themselves, help you?" Enraged, the king said to Alexandria, his wife, "I shall faint, I shall die, because I see that this man has got the best of me." Her response was, "Cruel, bloodthirsty tyrant, did I not tell you not to go on mistreating the Christians, because their God would fight for them? Now let me tell you that I want to become a Christian." Stupefied, the king cried, "Oh, worse and worse! See, you too have been led astray." Thereupon he had her hung up by the hair of her head and beaten with scourges. While she was being beaten, she said to George, "O George, light of truth, what do you think will become of me since I have not been reborn in the waters of baptism?" "You have nothing to fear, lady," he answered. "The shedding of your blood will be both your baptism and your crown." And with that she prayed to the Lord and breathed her last. Ambrose testifies to this, saying in his preface, "For this reason the queen of the pagan Persians, though she had not yet been baptized, was shown mercy and received the palm of martyrdom when her cruel spouse had condemned her to death. Hence we may not doubt that she, crimson with the dew of her blood, gained entrance through the celestial portal and merited the kingdom of heaven." The following day, George was sentenced to be dragged through the whole city and then beheaded. He prayed the Lord that all who implored his help might have their requests granted, and a heavenly voice came to him saying that it would be so. His prayer finished, his head was cut off, and his martyrdom accomplished in the reign of the emperors Diocletian and Maximin, which began about the year of our Lord 287. As for Dacian, while he was on his way back from the palace to the place of execution, fire fell from above and consumed him and his attendants. Gregory of Tours relates that some men were carrying away relics of St. George and were given hospitality at a certain chapel overnight, and in the morning they were absolutely unable to move the casket containing the relics until they had shared them with the oratory. And in the history of Antioch, we read that during the Crusades, when the Christians were on their way to besiege Jerusalem, a very beautiful young man appeared to a certain priest. He told the priest that he was St. George, the captain of the Christian host, and that if the Crusaders carried his relics to Jerusalem, he would be with them. Then, when they had laid siege to the city, they did not dare mount the scaling ladders in the face of the Saracens' resistance, but St. George appeared to them wearing white armour marked with a red cross, and made them understand that they could follow him up the walls in safety, and the city would be theirs. Thus reassured, the army took the city and slaughtered the Saracens. A story not for the faint-hearted.